Hey everyone, it's Nightharrow here, and today I have my Stamina Sorcerer build guide for you. So as always, everything's timestamped down below, so feel free to go ahead and skip around. So we'll start off here with why would you want to play a Sorcerer, and why would you want to play a Stamina Sorcerer in particular? Well, the answer to that is that Sorcerers provide several buffs that are either unique or semi-unique. One buff that isn't quite unique, but is definitely the best place to get it, for your entire group is Major Berserk. Major Berserk increases your damage done by 10%, and there's not really a great place to get this buff for your entire group besides a Sorcerer, and it comes from our ultimate, our Storm Atronach. We can also provide Minor Prophecy for our group, which increases our critical strike chance by quite a bit, and it ends up being like a 5 to 7% actual damage increase, just from that one unique buff. You can get a similar buff that gives weapon critical instead of spell critical from a Nightblade, but typically in any optimized group, you either want a Nightblade or a Sorcerer in the group because of this. And again, because of the hybridization changes, the game will pick whichever one is higher, so typically you only need one of these in a group, but you do absolutely want one of them. Other reasons you might want to play a Sorcerer is that it's a fairly easy style of play. So with our two pets, you don't always have to use them, and you can actually just leave them inactive. In that case, you only have a 6-button rotation. So a lot easier than a 10-button rotation. And if you think about it, it's almost as easy as a 1-bar rotation. And so that's why a lot of people like Sorcs, because they are easy to parse on, easy to get a lot of damage on, and you can also still provide multiple unique or semi-unique buffs for the group, which increases the party's damage by quite a bit. Honestly, it's up there with DK as far as utility, so having at least one Sorc in the group is pretty important. Other reasons you might want to play Sorcerer is it's just really fun. So when you have teleport abilities with Streak or with Bolt, which allow you to move quickly from one place to another, that can be very useful. You also have some skills that basically let you be a pseudo tank with our bound armaments and some of our shields, so there's quite a bit of survivability built into the Sorcerer. I think most people probably know that though. So with that, let's go ahead and just move in and start talking about some of our skills here, and then after that, we'll talk about gear and then the rest of our setup with CP and everything else. So first up here is going to be Daedric Prey. This is a hugely important skill for our build, and one we'll want to be keeping up all the time. Now, this skill, whenever you cast it, it does damage, and then after 6 seconds, it does damage again. You really want to let that second tick of damage go off, and you'll see the explosion happen whenever it does before you recast it. You don't want to be recasting this early. It's better to recast it a little bit late rather than a little bit early. Now, this skill also buffs the damage done by our pets, and we're really going to be leaning into this, okay? Besides our 2 pets that we have on our bar, we also have our Storm Atronach ultimate, and then we're going to typically be using Maw of the Infernal, which is another pet, okay? So lots of pets. Daedric Prey buffs the damage of all of those abilities by 45%. Abilities and gear sets and everything else by 45%. And if we're running Aegis Caller, it's also going to buff that set as well, because that is considered a pet, okay? So a lot of reasons why you want to run Daedric Prey. The other morph of this, I will note, a lot of people feel that it does more damage in content. That's only because it does more AoE damage, and sometimes there's smaller mobs that it'll proc on. And so if you're on PC and you're looking at your add-ons, you'll see that it does do more total damage. In general, that extra damage on those AoE targets is not really a big deal, and you're not really worried about it because it's usually the main boss that you're trying to kill, and everything else will die and cleave in AoE and everything like that. So I would stick with Daedric Prey on this morph in most situations. After that, we have Crystal Fragments. So this skill, we're not typically going to be casting this except for when it procs. And what I mean by that is that every time you cast the skill, you have a chance of causing this to be an instant cast ability. And so that's generally speaking when we're going to be using it. So we'll use a different skill for our main spammable, keep up our rotation as normal, and then when we see this proc, and you'll see like a little glowy box around it, or if you're on PC, you can also get add-ons that'll give you a tone that'll pop up. And whenever you hear that, then your next skill cast will be Crystal Fragments. That's just the best way to get the most optimal DPS from a Sorcerer. Now, we'll note, to get that unique buff from the Sorcerer, that Minor Prophecy, we need to cast some skill from our Dark Magic skill line at least once every 20 seconds, and Crystal Fragments is what's going to do it for us on this particular build. So whenever you're actually going into a pull, you'll typically want to pre-buff everything as much as you can, and then you'll actually cast this, and it'll have the full cast time and everything else, and you can just use that as your opener to go ahead and get that buff procced on your group, and then after that, you'll only be casting it whenever it procs the instant cast ability. After that, we have our main spammable, which is going to be Rapid Strikes. So this is what we'll be casting most often. This is a channeled spammable. It looks kind of weird. You're like flailing your arms around, but with the recent changes to how status effects work, this is going to be the best skill to be using as our spammable, and it's actually kind of jumped. It was the best I think in most terms, but now with the changes, it's gone even higher. So I tend to hate channeled spammables and to prefer something else. but it just does enough damage here that's why I want to stick with it. You could go with something else here though. You will lose a little bit of damage. If you're not in a super optimized group or trying to do maximum damage, it's not going to be the end of the world, but just realize it will be a DPS loss. And this is from the dual wield skill line. After that, we have our pets. So we'll start off here with the Volatile Familiar. We will actually be casting this ability. So, it goes back and forth whether or not you ever want to cast your pets at all. Just realize when you're actually in content, whenever you cast your Volatile Familiar, it will do a stun in addition to the AoE damage that it does. And so you want to be careful to do that because it can be really annoying for your tanks if you accidentally stun mobs outside of groups. So there will be some situations where you probably just want to skip casting this if you're not sure when you should cast it. It will be a little bit of a DPS loss, but not the end of the world. In general, though, you'll be fine casting it. And then our last skill here is going to be our Twilight Tormentor. And then beneath that, I have the other morph of it, the Twilight Matriarch. So this skill, we just leave it on our bar. Generally speaking, we don't cast it. If we are in a situation where we're doing portals in a group content, like in Cloud Rest, or if we're running around Overland, or if we're doing an arena or some kind of solo content, typically you actually want to use the other morph of this, which is the Twilight Matriarch. The reason for that, it's a really big heal. It'll heal us and up to 2 other allies, so it's a really big burst heal. So it can actually be useful in dungeons as well if you have a fake healer or you're running without a healer or something like that. But in general, we don't lose too much damage by switching morphs of this skill. So in general, you do want to have both of these skills, both morphs fully leveled up, because you never know when you might want to use one. And it's better to just swap this to the healing morph than it is to drop one of our DPS abilities and instead slot a self-heal. So again, one of the reasons why it can be really nice and really easy to run a Sorc, because we don't really have to change too much. We only have to change our bar. We just have to change one skill morph to have a lot more survivability and to even be able to help out our group with a little bit of extra healing in certain situations. So again, Tormentor for maximum damage, Matriarch if we need a little bit of healing. And then we have our ultimate. So this is another flex spot here. So if you're kind of your average Joe, average gamer, you're newer to the game, you want a simpler rotation, then I would personally recommend Flawless Dawnbreaker. And this is from the Fighters Guild skill line. Just by being on our bar, we typically won't cast it, but just by being on our bar, it will increase our damage done by increasing our weapon and spell damage. And that's why we keep it here. If we're in a situation where the fight's about to end and we're not going to get enough to cast our Storm Atro on the back bar, you can go ahead and use this and it will increase your damage. It's a decent ultimate, but in general, we just leave it here for the passive and we don't actually cast it. Now, if you are either really into the Sorc vibe and you want to use a lot of Sorcerer skills, you like the lightning theme, or if you're just a little bit more of a sweaty player, then you would want to use something instead like Power Overload. Power Overload is one of our class ultimates, and what it does is you can hold out your hands and you shoot out lightning everywhere. And the Power Overload morph increases the damage, and you just click and hold your heavy attack. It's just kind of like a channeled heavy attack. And then what you want to do is make sure you have turned on your ultimate number so you know how much ultimate you have. It's just in the base game menu. And when you get close to 180, but still a little bit north of it, then you want to stop, and then you would cast your Storm Atro on your back bar. That's the way you get maximum DPS. So the way that this works is, let's say you're moving into a fight, you're going through some trash or an arena, however it works, before the boss fight, you're generating ultimate, right? Then you get max ultimate, or you get well over 180. And then when you enter in the fight, pre-buff, do all that good stuff, and then you just hit your channeled ultimate here and just hold on to it, okay? And then right before you get to 180, you go ahead and swap to your back bar, drop your Storm Atro, and then you just go about your rotation as normal, and you drop your Storm Atro every chance you get after that. And that will make sure you get these really big numbers, and it's the most effective thing to do for this build. But that is a little bit more difficult. It is quite a few more steps, so that's why I said, hey, if you don't want to use this, it's totally fine to just use the Fighters Guild Ultimate, Flawless Dawnbreaker, and it'll still do quite well. But honestly, it's a pretty fun ability, and the fact that the heavy attack is an AoE can also be useful for certain ad phases and everything else like that, although our Storm Atro now does a really good job as well, so, using the both if you can. Now moving on to our back bar, we're going to have a Maelstrom Arena, and we're going to be using Stampede with that. That'll just give us the most damage. With every weapon skill line, there is one skill on that skill line that'll keep your back bar enchantment procced even while on your front bar. And for our two-handed skill line, it's going to be Stampede. In addition to the Maelstrom buff, we need to be using the skill because that's what it enhances. It'll also be a good gap closer since we are melee. It will close the distance for us, and that can also be quite nice. Just make sure you don't spam it too much and run out of stamina because it is a bit expensive. But it really helps us get into melee quickly and get our damage down. After that, we have Barb Trap. Barb Trap we want for the minor force, which is just a passive whenever we have this ability on an opponent, but it also does quite a bit of damage. Not nearly as much as it used to, but still a decent amount. And again, we want to use it to help us get to that critical damage cap. Nothing else really needs to be said about it. Moving on from there, we have Hurricane. Hurricane is a really nice damage over time ability, and it also has a bunch of other functions, okay? So one, it'll give us a boost in our speed, which can be really nice in a lot of situations, far more than you might realize, and it's also just convenient whenever you're running on overland or if you're in an arena to be able to move quickly. If you're kiting opponents or if you're just running from point A to point B, it can be nice to have. You do need to realize it's always on once you cast it, so it is doing damage in an area around you, and so you want to be careful you don't aggro things you're not trying to aggro at certain times. Wait for the skill to tick all the way down in those situations. The other thing is it gives us Major Resolve, which Major Resolve will reduce our damage taken by about 9%, which is significant. So this is one of the reasons, as part of our normal damage rotation, we also have this skill that kind of actually lends itself more towards tanking and is something that's kind of required for any tank to have, Major Resolve. So it's just a really nice damage over time ability, gives us speed, gives us that Major Resolve, kind of no reason not to use it. But just know there are other options and you could put something else here. And similarly, if you need a utility skill to slot, we're really low on bar space, and this is kind of a problem with the Sorcerer because we do have our pets. We certainly don't want to drop Daedric Prey. We can't drop our Spammable. Crystal Fragments is really nice, but Crystal Fragments and Barb Trap, even though we both really want those, if you're in a situation where you're in an arena and you need maximum survivability, then Barb Trap is probably the first skill that I would drop. And then potentially after that, even though I hate to say this, probably Crystal Fragments, okay? Normally, you shouldn't need to swap out more than 2 skills. Honestly, you probably shouldn't need to swap out more than 1, but if you do, those are the 2 skills that you want to swap out. I know there might be a reason for it. Maybe you're playing around, you want Streak, you're farming, whatever it happens to be. I would go with Barb Trap first, and then, especially in AoE situations, probably do with Crystal Frags next. And then after that, in our back bar, we have our 2 pets that we've already talked about. They do need to be double barred. Also, if you're looking for a single bar, sorry, I probably should have said this early at the beginning. I have single bar builds. I have heavy attack builds for Sorcerer on the channel, and just go check those out if you're looking for something like that. For our ultimate, we're going to be using the charged Storm Atronach, the 3 Atronachs that spawn. The reason we're using them is because they guaranteed to proc the concuss status effect, which ends up just giving us more damage. So right now, there's no reason to use the greater Storm Atro. You really just want to use the charged Atronach, and so that's why we have this here. I will note that that is probably something that is not desirable by ZOS, and so it's very likely with the next patch, they could change that. And so just keep an eye out. If it changes for one situation, it'll probably change for others. But the Greater Storm Atronach used to do just a little bit extra damage. Now it does less damage in all situations. So you always want to be using this charged Atro. But just realize that I think in the next patch, that will probably change. They'll probably try to do something to change that. So check back in on the channel, come to the Discord and ask questions if you have something there. And that is it for our primary skills. So let's go ahead and move on, and we'll talk about some of these useful skills over here on the side. So first up here is going to be Ball, Lightning, or Streak. Both morphs of this skill work well and should be used in different situations. One morph will stun, the other morph will do damage. Both allow you to teleport very quickly, very rapidly. You can cast it multiple times. It does become more expensive, but it's really great if you're trying to get out of a bad situation, or if you're just running around overland to get around quickly. It can be quite nice to help speed things up for moving from point A to point B. After that, we have Dark Deal, another one where both morphs of this skill are both great. One morph costs Magicka and gives you back stamina and health. The other morph costs stamina and gives you back Magicka and health. Hopefully I said that right. But both morphs of this skill are good. There's reason to use both. The primary reason you're going to use one over the other is like, do I need more stamina or do I need more Magicka? And so you can use this as kind of a flex spot, particularly if you're in overland, you're worried about running out of Magicka or stamina for survivability. You could definitely swap this in. The fact that it gives you a bit of a heal is also kind of nice. After that, we have Crit Surge. Crit Surge is not nearly as good as it used to be, but this ability provides us with a bit of a heal over time, and that can be quite nice. Again, with our Twilight Matriarch and a lot of other situations, it's kind of a, if you're running around Overland and you want a bit of extra healing, then you could use Crit Surge and it would work fairly well for you. It used to be Crit Surge was the only thing you needed, but those days are long past, so Crit Surge has definitely fallen down as far as like how useful it is as a skill, but still well worth mentioning. After that's going to be Hardened Ward. This is our primary shield if we need one. This has gotten a buff recently and works quite well. Nothing else needs to be really said about it. If you need a shield in addition to a heal, then I would go with Hardened Ward. And then after that, we have Bound Aegis. Bound Aegis, whenever we cast a skill, it increases our block mitigation by 40%, which is huge. That's like having a sword and board or an ice staff on. Okay, so this is one of those skills that kind of makes this work extremely survivable in certain situations. If you're in like the Endless Archive or any other situation where you're tanking a big heavy attack by a mob, maybe you're Overland or something like that, Bound Aegis can keep you alive. It'll also give you several benefits that will continue to persist no matter what bar you're on. It'll give you minor protection and minor resolve. Minor resolve, if you're in group content, will typically come from a healer, so you typically don't need to worry about that, but the minor protection is actually quite nice, reducing your damage taken by another 5%. And you get kind of the idea that if you're solo and you can use minor protection and minor resolve, that's about a 9%, 10% damage reduction between the two of those abilities, and then also another 40% damage mitigation. It's kind of like with this skill and like Hardened Ward, you're pretty much a tank. And so that's where the group utility and the utility of running a sorcerer really comes in. Anyways, that's it for skills. And with that, I could say more about some of these. There are other skills that are useful for a sorcerer. I'm just highlighting the ones that I think are the most useful and the most interesting. Let's go ahead and move on and we'll talk about gear. So for our basic setup, if you're brand new to the game, you haven't farmed a bunch of gear, it's your first character or whatever, just go with the crafted set Order's Wrath. You can craft this in medium, which is what I would recommend. Typically you want to run 6 pieces of medium, 1 piece of light. That's what's optimal right now. And you can run that with anything else while you farm better gear, okay? So just run 5 pieces of Order's Wrath and then whatever else you have laying around. And then what I would recommend is going and farming Pillar of Nirn. Pillar of Nirn drops in Falkreath Hold. It's an amazing set because it works well on Magicka setups, it works well on Stamina setups, and it's very easy to use. If you do damage, it'll proc and it'll do more damage. Nothing really else has to be said about it. Pillar of Nirn is a really nice all-around set. Now, once you want to move past using just Order's Wrath and you're in optimized content or you want to do something harder, then go with something like Whirl of the Depths. Pillar of Nirn and Whirl of the Depths pair great together. They can work on any class, any setup. One's light, one's medium, so you can control how many pieces of each you have if you're having sustain problems and stuff like that. But this is just a great basic all-around setup for anybody. So if you get those sets, any character you get to level 50, you could easily put them on and it would work really well for them, okay? Now we'll pair that with several things. On our back bar, ideally we'll have a Maelstrom two-handed sword. If you're new to the game, you haven't farmed this yet, that's totally fine. You can just double bar one of the other sets, but I would personally recommend that you go into Maelstrom Arena. It will be challenging at first. Don't necessarily do it when you're like CP 160, but it's definitely something you want to learn to do, and it'll help you a lot with kind of learning the game, learning how to be survivable, maybe look up a guide so you kind of know what the mechanics are and stuff like that, but it's absolutely something you want to farm, and it'll really help progress your skill along. Now, we have several options to pair that with, okay? So if you're running around solo, then what I would recommend is Ring of the Pale Order. Ring of the Pale Order heals you for a percentage of the damage you caused. And it basically makes any build that does good damage, unkillable, okay? The only thing that will kill you in that situation is if you get one shot. So instead of worrying about survivability, you're just worried about doing more damage, and the only thing you have to worry about killing you is one shots in those situations. So it really lends itself to having a nice optimized build that does more damage, so you have to see less mechanics, and it heals you. So Ring of the Pale Order is amazing. I can't recommend it enough. If you're in a group situation though, Ring of the Pale Order is not going to do anything for you. Okay, the healing that it gives you goes down to 0 if you have several people in your group, and so you don't want to use it in that situation, and so then you want to go with something else. Or perhaps you're new and you just don't have any of these mythics farmed yet. Then you want to go with Maw of the Infernal. Maw of the Infernal is a very easy to get monster set, and because of our Daedric Prey, as we talked about earlier, it buffs all of our pets, and the Maw of the Infernal is considered a pet. This drops from Banished Cells 2, and you do have to run it on Veteran in order to get the monster set head, and then the shoulder piece you get from the Undaunted vendors. Again, a relatively easy to get set, and because of our Daedric Prey, it's actually the best thing to use. Now, if we don't have that, but we already have some mythics laying around, or if the Maw of the Infernal, it can be kind of annoying for a tanks because it is this big monster that gets in their way sometimes, you might be asked or want to run something else. In that case, something like the Velothi Urmage Amulet is a good way to go. It reduces the damage done by our light and heavy attacks, but increases our damage done by everything else, and it works everywhere, so it's kind of a good all-around mythic. Now, another option would also be running the Kilt, the Harpooner's Waiting Kilt. The problem with that, Moore got the most damage on that. That's what he prefers to run, but the problem with that is that if you're running around solo, or if you're in group content where you're still taking damage, it will drop stacks of the buff that the Kilt gives, and in which case it would be better to run something else. So in those situations, you would want to move back and just run Maw of the Infernal. For our sweatier setup here, we're going to swap out our 5-piece sets and leave everything else the same. In that case, I would recommend Coral Riptide. Coral Riptide does more damage based on how low our stamina is, so we do need to manage our stamina. We don't want a full stamina bar, okay? If you have a full stamina bar the entire time, Coral Riptide is not going to be doing anything for you, and so that's why typically at least under 50% is what you want to aim for with your stamina. If you keep it under 50%, you'll be doing good damage. A little bit lower is better, but at least under 50%. If you can maintain that, then I would recommend, and it would be fine to run Coral Riptide. And then we're going to pair that with Aegis Caller. This also gets buffed with our Daedric Prey bonus, so it just does the most damage. Now, for all of our traits, on our front bar right now, I'm still recommending Nirnhoned on our main weapon and then Charged on our off. Stay tuned. We'll find out over the next week or two. You might want to be running double charged on both of your front weapons. If you haven't recrafted anything, but you already have a Nirnhoned and a charged weapon, just stick with that, especially for now. The damage increase isn't going to be that big of a deal, and let's wait and see what happens over the next patch or two before you go recrafting a bunch of gear, but it could be the case that double charged might be the meta moving forward. We'll just have to wait and see. For our back bar, we're going to go infused with weapon damage. That's just very typical, what gives us the most damage. For our jewelry, we're going with Bloodthirsty on all 3 pieces, and then we want weapon damage enchants on those. And then for our body, it's all divines, all stamina enchants. Again, very typical what you'd run on any other build setup. For our CP, we're going to be running Wrathful Strikes to give us increased weapon and spell damage, Deadly Aim, Master at Arms, and then Exploiter. Exploiter, we do need our target to be off balance, but if you're in any kind of group content, that's going to happen no matter what, so you can just kind of run it. If you are in solo content, you might not have a source of off balance, and you're also probably going to be under on the critical damage cap, and so something like Fighting Finesse would be the way to go for maximum damage. And again, with these CP, we're just using what does the most damage. That's really all that's going on here. For our slottable red CP, this is really a choose your own adventure. I'm mentioning here 4 CP that I often like, but really you can run whatever you'd like. Fortified will increase our armor, which reduces our damage taken. That's always helpful in all situations. Celerity gives us an extra 10% speed while in combat. Being able to move faster, turns out, is actually very useful. So this is one you can definitely take out if you don't need it, but it's just kind of a nice to have. Expert Evasion. This almost never leaves my CP tree, okay? Expert Evasion gives you a free roll dodge, and especially if you're running something like Coral Riptide, we're already trying to keep your stamina low, or just survival in general, having a free roll dodge once every 30 or so seconds is huge and helps your survivability quite a bit. Rejuvenation just gives us a little bit of extra recovery. If you're trying to keep your stamina low and you're having problems, this actually might be one that you don't want. You might want to take it out and swap something else. Again, any CP that looks good, sounds good to you, that's what you want to slot here. There's no wrong answer with the red CP in most situations. Something like Slippery can have very great utility in certain situations and then none in other situations. But again, just take a look around, pick whatever you'd like, whatever sounds good. And then for our tribute points, we're going to put all of our points in stamina. For those who don't know, having more max stats does increase your damage. The game chooses whichever one is highest, and then it converts that to weapon or spell damage. I'm simplifying, but that's the way it works. And then it gives you more weapon and spell damage, which increases your damage, okay? The game picks whichever one of your highest base stats are, and then that gives you the equivalent of weapon and spell damage. And then for Mundus, we're just going to go with the Thief. That increases our critical strike chance. It's just the best thing for maximum damage right now. For our race, potions and food, the most optimal race is Dark Elf. Dark Elf is also really nice because it works basically just as well as the best thing. It's within a margin of error of the best thing for Magicka builds as well. So if you decide to respec this build at some later date. Wood Elf, if you really like Wood Elves, this is a great class for it. You're going to lose a little bit of damage, not much. Orc, also very good. Khajiit would actually be best probably for Overland if you're running solo and not with a group. But any class you want, the maximum damage you're going to lose is about 5%. Okay, so just subtract about 5% off of the theoretical max, and that's what you're, if you pick the worst class, like a Magicka base class, and you're running stamina, that's about how much you're going to lose. Not the end of the world unless you're score pushing or something like that. So don't worry about it too much. Play the race you want to play. We're going to go with weapon power potions, the one that provide the 3 bonuses. One is more stamina, then it's a weapon critical, and then weapon damage. It's a little bit confusing because the base, like trash potions as we call them, are also called weapon power or weapon damage. So it's kind of weird. And then for our food, we're going with something like sticky pork and radish noodles. There's several foods that gives the same buff. You just want something that gives you only max health and max stamina. That will give you the most damage and have the most utility. If you're running low on stamina, then you might want to run some sort of recovery food. This will happen when you're overland or in smaller group content potentially, and in which case you could run something like Lava Foot Stomp is what you would use to Parses historically. You could also use Dubious Cameron Throne if you want more max health, max stamina, and then stamina recovery. It's really up to you. Just keep in mind that the first thing is having more max stamina will give you more damage. So that's the most important thing for having more max damage. But if you're running out of stamina, that you're going to die, and also it's going to decrease your damage considerably. So you want to run something with recovery in that case, and just realize the more stats you add to a particular kind of food that you're using, the less of those max stats you're going to get, and so therefore a little bit less damage you're going to do. Not the end of the world. And I think that's it for this build today. I know that's a lot. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them down below, or to come by the That Wasn't the Boss Discord server. We have help channels for all roles, and there's a lot of people there that have even more knowledge than I do, and we'll be more than happy to give you specific and tailored advice. If you want to modify something and you're not sure what to do, that's probably the best place to go. I'm more than happy to answer questions down below, but sometimes the back and forth with YouTube, I don't get pings, and I can miss things, and it's not intentional. I'm not ignoring you. I just literally didn't see it. YouTube didn't pop up and show me. So anyways, that's it for today. Appreciate you guys watching, and we'll catch you in the next one.